Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I want to ask the front row to do me a favor, and when Miriam starts giving me a time limit and I don't see her, if you'd point to her so that she doesn't have to go through histrionics to get my attention. I want to take up a challenge that Martin Hellwig gave us yesterday to step away from our models and to take a hard look at the real world. And I'd like to do that in particular to understand in a bit more depth the effects of the crisis as well as the turn to austerity in a number of countries. And a lot of this is based, and I'm going to talk about some new research that has been done by feminist economists, by stratification economists, that I hope will inform post-Keynesians. And I also really want to bring into this the ramifications of the events of the last 10 years in terms of the political fallout and the move to the right. And I'm hopeful that at the end of this, I'll give you some thing to think about in terms of what have been those causes and opening up to thinking about some new areas that perhaps haven't been covered. So a number of people in this room have written extensively about the factors leading up to the crisis, and a good deal of attention has been focused on the financial sector, the income growth and the wealth growth of the top 1%. I think less so. I want to talk more about the bottom of the distribution, and not just the bottom 20%, but the bottom 60 to 80% of the distribution. And so what I see as three key changes that have happened in the last 20 or so years that have affected, that have created instability amongst the working class themselves. One of those, of course, is the labor market changes that have led to precarious work that has a lot of different origins in developing countries. It has to do in some sense with IMF conditionalities, for example, but in other countries it's a variety of factors, including governments simply deregulating labor markets. Another factor, of course, has been weakened social safety nets that have made life much more economically insecure for families, and of course increased macro volatility due to globalization and financial liberalization. In case you can't read the bottom of this, it says, and the winner of this week's race to the bottom is, and we have a variety of candidates. What I think has been missing in this discussion is an understanding of the changes in the interclass dynamics. And in particular, one of the phenomena that has been most salient with regard to political change has been the downward harmonization of the economic condition of whites, and in particular white males, to the economic insecurity that people of color and women have always experienced. They have certainly not reached the low levels of quality of life of women and people of color, but that downward harmonization has been a shock to their system, and I think there is some real reason for concern about that and acknowledgement of it. So I want to just give you a few pieces of evidence, but I've done a lot of work in recent years at the local level and spend a lot of time in communities, and what I see is people living lives of quiet desperation that on their surface look like they're doing fine, but people are struggling psychologically for a variety of different reasons, and a lot of that has to do with the changes in the economic system. So many of you may be familiar with this study by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. It was 2015, and I'm going to show you a slide from their 2017 paper in which what we're observing is not only increased economic insecurity, but higher mortality rates, and for the first time, shorter life expectancy, and this is in the United States. And this has to do with what we might call deaths by despair. Suicide is one of the leading causes, the opioid epidemic, and alcohol-related liver mortality. So not only are people economically increasingly insecure, but their very life quality has declined dramatically in recent years. This is a graph that looks at white mortality rates. And this is for the group 50 to 54, where the sharpest decline in life expectancy was observed. And the red line you see is white non-Hispanics. You see B and H is black non-Hispanics, white non-Hispanics all, and Hispanics. So the red line is white non-Hispanics, with less than a high school education or less. And this is the group that has experienced the greatest increase in mortality in the last 20 years. And it's the group that has, in many ways, suffered the most from the increase in precarious work, the cuts to social spending, and the impacts of globalization. And what you'll notice is that, that although white non-Hispanic mortality is lower than that of blacks, it is this particular segment of the white population that has actually been doing worse than blacks. They had been, let me just say this, they'd been doing roughly 30% better before roughly 2006, and since 2006, the gap between black non-Hispanic mortality and whites with less than a high school education is roughly 30%. There's another phenomenon that's interesting, and this comes from research that Alyssa Bronstein and I are just finished and are publishing. We've been looking at trends in gender inequality globally and trying to understand why we see, in some cases, improvements in gender equality at the same time that if you look at the functional distribution of income or the size distribution of income, inequality is actually worsening. So in this graph, on the x-axis, what you see is the percentage change in men's employment rate, that is the employment to population rate. And on the y-axis, what you see is a measure of gender equality. It's the women's rate relative to the men's rate. So anything in the right upper quadrant is a great scenario. It's gender cooperative, we might say. So men are doing better in terms of access to jobs, but women are even doing better than that, so that the gender gap in employment is closing. What we found was 70% of the countries that we looked at, of roughly 160 countries, 70% are crowded into, are in the upper left quadrant, meaning that women's employment relative to men's has been increasing at the same time that men's employment has been declining. It's not that women have been taking men's jobs, but rather that structural change in the economy has led to a decrease in the type of jobs that men take, and there's been an expansion of precarious work in particular that women have typically taken. Nevertheless, this is perceived as gender conflictive. And I wasn't going to show this slide because it was a little provocative, but oops. And so there's this phenomenon. There's a great article in the New York Times. I encourage you to read it because it describes this dynamic very, very well. It's about a factory in Alabama in which the factory eventually closed up and moved out. Men no longer have employment. Women have gone to work. Women who hadn't worked, they'd gone back to work, but in really low-wage jobs that men have been unwilling to take. And there's a perception that women are crowding out men because they are taking these low-wage jobs. But a lot of this has to do with the structure of the economy. And nevertheless, it triggers gender conflict and some of the gender backlash that we've seen. So I want to give you some thoughts on how I think we could understand the political fallout from, in terms of the rightward shift in politics from these trends. And I think that the recent insights of stratification economics and feminist economics can tell us something about that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with stratification economics, let me just give you a 30-second blurb on it. Stratification economics departs from the view that inequality is not a result of individual dysfunction or deficiencies, but rather that inequality is structurally created by dominant groups to maintain their place in the hierarchy. And in much of this work, the main focus in terms of intergroup inequality is race and gender, but in some countries it might be religion, for example, Myanmar, in India, in Sri Lanka, and there may be other categories, but typically we associate stratification with ascriptive characteristics. And there are two mechanisms by which stratification works. One is exploitation, that is paying people less than they're worth or extracting excessive rents from a particular group. And the second is exclusion, that is hoarding. And I think of that in terms of hoarding good jobs, for example. With regard to exploitation, of course, it's a Marxist term. but we can apply it in two ways currently. The fact that women perform unpaid work in the home that is beneficial to firms and society as a whole, and also the work that Gary Dymski did with regard to the financial crisis, in which he talks about the fact that it is blacks and single mothers that were super included in the predatory loans that were given in the subprime crisis after being before being having been super excluded from access to credit, and that the high prices that both blacks and single mothers paid for those loans really were rents to the financial sector. So just to give you an example of what we mean by exclusion and hoarding. And I think what is often missed is that stratification by race and gender are pronounced, and they often can override class concerns. So stratification, I think that, a stratification approach to understanding macroeconomics and distributional dynamics is very helpful. And I want to suggest the following to you, that capitalism produces good jobs, bad jobs, and no jobs. Racial and gender hierarchies influence who gets the bad jobs and the lack of jobs, that is, the unemployment. And what I think is significant in this is that macroeconomic conditions themselves influence the degree of racial and gender animus and inequality. At the beginning of the crisis in 2008, there were a number of economists from this perspective who were predicting the rise of racism and the anti-immigrant sentiment that we see in Europe, largely exacerbated by the insecurity created by the crisis. And so, not surprisingly, macroeconomics during economic hard times leads to gender and racial hostility worsening, as we have seen in a number of countries. So what might we learn from feminist economics? I'm going to just refer to a paper that Alyssa and I have just published. It's actually the graph I showed you is from this paper. One of the things that we found is, although employment gaps between men and women are closing globally, that gender job segregation is increasing quite dramatically. And in particular, women are increasingly excluded from the fewer good jobs that exist. And by that, we're defining those as industrial sector jobs. And one of the interesting things that we found with this is that in some econometric work is that this gender job segregation, that is, those countries in which gender job segregation has worsened, had the largest declines in the labor share of income. And the reasoning that we have for this is that there is a threat of job loss that is manifested by women being crowded into the secondary labor market with wages being driven down, and it psychologically reduces the bargaining power of workers in the primary sector. But I want to refer to some of Rudiger's comments as well, which are well taken, and a lot of feminist work has contributed to some understandings about family dynamics and gender relations that I think are important for us to understand as macroeconomics. What you see here is a photograph that shows, it's actually an image that shows up on Nancy Folbray's book, Who Pays for the Kids? And it's in this, she was really the pioneer of the work on social reproduction. So just as in environmental economics, we have a lot of work being done on eco-services that don't show up in GDP accounts, so it is that care work, which doesn't show up in GDP accounts if it's unpaid work, is nevertheless economically necessary and contributes a great deal not only to current productivity but to future productivity. So in this graph you see workers coming out of the factory, and you go home and you replenish yourself in order to go back and be a productive worker the next day. What is significant about this is that women disproportionately perform this work. But there's also the investment of time and energy into raising children that goes far beyond what we think of as human capital. And we could call this as human capacities. The capacity to be emotionally regulated, the ability to work in teams, the ability to be able to socially integrate. All of these, to have moral and ethical behavior, for example, all of those take intensive time on the part of those that care and have long-run impacts on productivity. So taking those two perspectives into consideration, I want to give you a mini analysis of the financial crisis and beyond. And one of the things that happened at the beginning of the crisis was that it was called a man session, that there was a sense that it was men that disproportionately were hurt during this recession as a result of the fact that the recession began in the financial sector, but then in the construction and manufacturing sector, which are male-dominated. And it is true that men lost their jobs in those sectors, but the reality is that disproportionately it was men of color and immigrant men who lost their jobs relative to white men. And also, single mothers in particular lost their jobs relative to married men and married women. And this is where stratification plays a role about who gets the bad news of capitalism. So just briefly, a few graphs here. This graph shows you unemployment rates in the United States by race for whites, Hispanics, and blacks. And what you see, of course, is that the black unemployment rate and the Hispanic unemployment rate are always greater than the white unemployment rate, but that surge at the beginning of the crisis was several percentage points higher for blacks and Hispanics than it was for all whites, men and women. One of the things that, for those of you who are looking for a PhD dissertation, this is one of the more interesting things that has come out of the crisis that has not been, thank you, thanks, that has not been discussed too much, and that is that single mothers also get the bad news of capitalism, and we can call this family responsibility discrimination. And so you see here that at the beginning of the crisis, yes, married men in particular lost more jobs than married women, but there was a dramatic surge in single mothers losing jobs through the progression of the recession in the United States. This is also true in Europe, and I'll just point you to the green bars here, which is the ratio of the unemployment rate of extra-EU men and women relative to native-born males. And you can see in some places like Belgium, the unemployment rate was 470% higher for immigrant men or non-native men in that country and women, and similarly in Sweden and Switzerland. So this is a phenomenon not just in the US, but also in Europe. And also, as the crisis wore on, the burdens of austerity shifted in particular to women and ethnic subordinate groups. Why? Because due to austerity, first of all, those groups disproportionately benefit from social services because of their precarious economic conditions, but also because women in particular have been concentrated in the types of jobs that have been cut in austerity programs, especially in social services. I'll just show you this graph from the Women's Budget Group in the UK, which has developed a model to analyze the effects of the government's cuts to social spending and increases in taxes. And I just want to point you to the lowest bar here, which is lone mother families, and the tax cuts for the tax increases and government spending cuts for 2010 to 2020 result in roughly an 18% decrease in income for lone mother families, the families that can least afford these cuts, and moreover, the children that can least afford these cuts. This is another graph, and I won't delay because just to move on, but we can also see that black and ethnic minorities in the UK also have been disproportionately disadvantaged by austerity. So my point may be, well, maybe you knew all of that already, but I think that it is important I think there is some value added to this stratification feminist approach. And one of those is that interclass conflict is important for us to understand in terms of the political dynamics of what are going on right now. And that I think we have not paid sufficient attention to white male economic insecurity and downward harmonization that have been fueling racial and ethnic and immigrant animosity and the gender backlash, with the result that we have seen in terms of Trump, La Lega in Italy, and other political parties. So I want to deliver on my promise of the title of this paper by talking about what I think are some of the contributions of feminist and stratification economists post-crisis that can help us. First of all, the first is that cuts to social spending and economic instability have long-term negative effects on human development and productivity. And by saying this, I'm really speaking to my post-Keynesian macroeconomists colleagues who focus a lot on the demand side. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to lose my demand-driven credentials, but I think that we also have paid insufficient attention to the supply side, and the feminist contribution here is particularly important. So let me say a few more things. I think that economists and policymakers can learn a lot from new research in brain neuroscience. And what we find is that the impact of poverty, the impact of economic instability, the impact of social spending cuts lead to more than hysteresis. The neuroscience of poverty tells us that there are long-term effects on the brain of deprivation, and that those effects are particularly negative for children during sensitive periods. And so I kind of point you to various areas of the brain that are affected, but what it tells us is that the effects on the cognitive skills of children are lifelong as a result of austerity and other kinds of economic volatility that disrupt family well-being. And there's a lot of, the research in this area is now moving to brain scans that do scans of brains. In this particular case, you'll look, there are pairs of brain scans, and the ones on the left are children who who come from family with adequate income and more parental education. And those on the right are children who live in poverty and have some kind of economic deprivation. And what you see is that the brain surface of children on the left is much more developed than those on the right. You literally see empty spaces in the brain that don't develop as a result of some of the economic policies that we've adopted. And some of the research shows that small increases in family income actually have a much larger effect on the impact on the brains of the poorest children than on similar increases for well-off children. And so there are enormous negative effects of austerity on children as well as adults, no doubt, but in particular on children that have dramatically negative effects for long-run productivity growth in these countries. And these effects are delivered in a variety of ways, but certainly through social spending cuts, and especially because the impacts of the crisis have disproportionately fallen to people of color and women, and especially single mothers who can least afford those cuts. So here's the encouraging part. I think that there's been some great work done by feminist economists in the last few years on this topic, and in particular on how we can target fiscal spending in a way that can reduce intergroup inequalities, reduce competition amongst the working class, if you will, men and women of color, women and people of color, and can actually stimulate long-run growth. So a good deal of work has been done on, and this is particularly relevant to developing countries, that physical infrastructure development, aside from having, aside from having a positive impact on the demand side impact, if well targeted, can reduce women's care burden, which is excessive in developing countries. It allows them, therefore, to access paid work, and it increases their bargaining power within the household, because the research is telling us that women tend to spend a higher percentage of their income on children than do men. And so fiscal policy that improves their bargaining power is likely to improve investments in children. And I'm just mentioning here one of many studies by Marcia Fontana and Lucia Nadali on Tanzania that did a simulation of a physical infrastructure investment that would dramatically increase women's income. Men's income would rise too, but it rises in a way that leads to a narrower gender wage gap. I don't think as much work has been done on using physical infrastructure investment to address racial inequalities. Nevertheless, it is very clear that this can be a very beneficial way to close racial gaps. And the most recent example is Flint, Michigan, in terms of water contamination and the long-term health effects of that. Let me get to another area that I think that feminist economists have really begun to develop, and that is the impact of social infrastructure spending. And in particular, what feminist economists have moved to do is to define social spending not as discretionary spending, but an investment. And an investment in terms of promoting an infrastructure that can stimulate the entire economy. And it reflects the fact that investment in people's capabilities has a public goods quality that with positive spillover effects for the rest of the economy. There's some great work done by Dennehow and Himmelwaite. And in particular, what they do is a model that looks at what's the impact of spending 2% of GDP either on the care sector of the economy or the construction sector of the economy. And what they find is that in the short term, women's unpaid work falls, their access to paid work increases, eventually gender wage gaps close, and in the long run, there's productivity growth. There's another study that has been done by Antonopoulos et al. That also has a very similar approach, and what they find is social service sector jobs, if that is where the fiscal spending goes, has a positive effect on disadvantaged workers, both women and people of color, and that it has a higher multiplier than spending in the construction sector. A couple of other studies, but because Oslem is here, I want to mention her study, which is one of the first ones that does formal modeling of public investment using a Kaleckian type of model that is also engendered, and I think it's a great direction for us to go in. I also want to mention the work of Alyssa Bronstein and Daniele Tavani that was mentioned earlier that I think is path-breaking work in terms of integrating social reproduction into Kaleckian type models. One of the questions that might be asked, and certainly in developing countries, is whether there's actually fiscal space for public investment. And this is where I think feminists have taken us in a new direction. And to label this as social infrastructure spending, recognizing that it has an investment quality in the same way that an investment in the private sector yields a rate of return into the future as a result of higher productivity. I don't think we have done enough work in this area. I'm hopeful that we will do much more empirical work in this area, but one of the examples of this is actually James Heckman's work in which he looks at the impact of early childhood education, and his point is that the rate of return for early investment childhood education is roughly 7 to 10% as a rate of return. And I think it's those kinds of data at the popular level that is likely to engender support for policies that will address the issues that we are concerned with. And I'm hopeful that much more can be done in that area. I think I have 1 minute left, and I'm not going to say too much because 1 minute, what can I say? But I want to say that I think that one of the things that feminist economists and stratification economists have also done is taken on monetary policy. There is a criticism that monetary policy has a narrow set of goals, in particular inflation, that it's missing the point by trying to address inflation by curtailing demand and thus wages, and that it especially ignores the supply-side causes of inflation, in particular in developing countries, which may be due to low productivity due to ill health and lack of education, poor infrastructure, and so forth. As I read through this list, I'm beginning to think that the United States fits into this category as well, and perhaps some other countries. And of course, the assumption, perhaps by some at least, that monetary policy is distributionally neutral. So let me just end with a couple of thoughts for you in terms of propositions for future heterodox research. First of all, I think one of the most important things for us to do is to expand the monetary policy toolkit. And I really refer to the work of Gerald Epstein, who I think has been phenomenal in this area. One example, for example, is asset-based reserve requirements to help you reach priority groups, to encourage credit to be extended perhaps for affordable housing, or to stimulate job-creating investments, for example. And the other I want to suggest is perhaps a little bit more controversial, but I'd like to ask you to think about it, and that is at least a partial role reversal for monetary and fiscal policy. We've often thought that monetary policy is for inflation and fiscal policy is for employment, and I want to suggest that actually it might be a little bit different than that. Monetary policy, if you use asset-based reserve requirements and other tools, can actually stimulate employment growth, for example, and can stimulate the demand side of the economy. And fiscal policy, if well targeted, could address the supply-side causes of inflation. So let me just close with this thought. You all remember unified field theory from back whenever you took physics. And my hope is that rather than continuing to work separately, that those of us, Malcolm Sawyer, I know, did some recent work on post-Keynesian ecological economics. Feminists are doing great work. Post-Keynesians are doing great work. I think it's important for us to unify these various threads into models and policy concerns that address all of these issues. But I fundamentally think it is also important for us to consider the impact of inter-class inequality by race and gender to solve some of the political problems that we're facing. Thank you.